Hey everybody, welcome back to Cordial Curiosity. I'm in a very special situation here today. I've got Brett Hall, Carlos de la Guardia, and PF Jung, Paul, right?
Yeah.
Here in Austin, Texas. We were on our way, me and Brett, to Palm Springs for Freedom Fest. We figured we'd stop by, and these guys now live here, and I just wanted to hang out and have a nice conversation. You two already had a nice conversation already today about tons of great stuff, computation, universality, all the great David Deutsch, Popper stuff.
Good work.
And yeah, you can check that out probably, here. I'll put a link up to it. And I just wanted to synthesize potentially ideas from Popper and Deutsch, and maybe Jordan Peterson, Bret Weinstein from Paul's perspective. I've seen and read and watched tons of content from all these people, and I think there's some overlap and some interesting things to discuss here. And, but I can start with Paul. Like, what is your project, Paul? You've got the meme war. You want to win the meme war.
I'd say my project broadly is articulating the rules of the great meme war. We're in a war of ideas for our culture, right? That's basically just the state of things. And the two pillars to what I'm trying to do is identify which ideas we actually want to win, which is a very difficult project. But then I think the more interesting sort of technical other side of that is articulating the rules of memetic warfare. There's rules of military warfare, right? Don't stretch your supply lines too thin, never invade Russia in the winter, stuff like that. Well, there's also rules to memetic warfare, how ideas transfer to people. And in a meme way, I reduce it to vibes and intuition, a lot of it, right? Like, I think most people intuitively, or know that if you just communicate an idea rationally, rarely that changes anyone's mind, especially if it's like over a controversial kind of value-laden question. If you're just articulating like an educational concept that they're already open to, that's one thing. But especially in the time of conflict we find ourselves in, it's important to know how to convince people of ideas, and ideally you convince them of the good ones, which I call radical enlightened centrism, right? The far left is dumb but has good ideas, and the far right is dumb and has good ideas. We need to synthesize them and then be radical about it, because the moderate status quo is not necessarily adapting fast enough in the face of all of the myriad of threats we face, AGI being one of them, climate change being another, and so on and so forth. So that's my project. Is there more that you want me to elaborate on? Or?
That's good. I'll just comment on that. Like, I also have a project of street epistemology, which is a kind of way of changing minds potentially. It's a critical thinking persuasion technique, set of ideas to help people critically think about whatever. And it's more Socratic. It's not, just giving people facts and evidence and hoping they'll change their minds. No, we have a bunch of trial and error where we have done this conversational method since 2013, uploaded examples on YouTube, criticized it, and it's evolved into this, I think, really powerful set of conversational techniques. But the purpose is to help people think better and more critically about whatever, and then potentially you could use that as a persuasion technique for getting better memes out there in the culture. So that's my main project, and that's maybe what overlaps a bit with Paul. And it's about epistemology, so that's a big overlap with Deutsch and Popper. So I guess Brett and Carlos, can you just give a quick background on yourself and how you might be relevant to this conversation?
So my main interest, I suppose, is in epistemology, so I have Topcast there, obviously. And it's interesting, you're both talking about how, at least you're circulating around the idea of how to have better ideas or better memes. And I've often thought that simply refuting someone's bad idea is never going to be enough to persuade them, because they always need somewhere to jump to. It's like that old adage that every retired engineer wants to send the professional physicist their paper on how they've disproven Einstein. Now, they might have all sorts of criticisms of Einstein, but unless you've got something better to replace it with, trying to say this thing is wrong and bad isn't actually going to be persuasive to very many people at all. It's like the old atheism debate. Just by criticising a person's belief in God, okay, that's one thing. But unless you've got something to hold up and to offer them that's going to actively replace or fill that hole, very few people, Sam Harris says, it's about as frequent that you will see a supernova blast in real time as you'll see someone change their mind, you know. So yeah, you need some sort of better idea to jump to, which is why, you know, I'm really interested in Popper and Deutsch, because I find Deutsch's ideas, the beginning of infinity, for example, preeminently, is so grand and cosmic in its outlook that it does have very much a spiritual feel to it. I don't know if you found the same.
Oh yeah, it's this very wide. I think my interest is partly in the Popper stuff, and you know, Karl Popper has this great book called like The Myth of the Framework, where it's all about different cultures colliding and whether that can lead to something good or not, and what to expect. And it may be rare to see somebody change their mind completely, but in his book he kind of argues like, if you hit somebody else that thinks differently from you and you didn't even know they existed before, you have changed your mind. That's a weird idea over there, and that is a change of a kind. As far as my usual projects, it's more like I'm interested in the super broad picture of how knowledge grows in general, and that applies to biological evolution, where genes are growing, and then it applies to memes and how those work. And my really main interest is in what makes the human mind especially powerful. And I think the core thing that makes us powerful is our ability to create new ideas, take the ideas that we've created, distinguish the good from the bad, and to do these in a very efficient way that not only is efficient and fast, but also converges on the truth. And I think that's what is happening at a more conversational level here, where you think, okay, well, assuming you have a mind that is capable of all these things, then what? Then you have these conversations and a culture that hopefully can, again, culturally converge on good ideas. So yeah, I have this more 10,000-foot view, I think. I don't often think too specifically about how culture should work, but I'm more about like, how does a mind even participate in culture, arguably? But I think a lot of the core things are common.
Cool. So how can these guys help you out, Paul?
Yeah.
Or you have any questions for them?
Well, actually, I was going to maybe start by levying a challenge to you, because I recall Peter Boghossian reacted to the meme adoption curve video I made. And in the second half, that's when I first encountered Deutsch, with the idea of memes are made sticky by being rationally critiqued, right? It's like is that the idea that...
There's two ways in which a meme will propagate in general, and Carlos can correct me here. But yes, if it's a rational meme, then the critical method being applied to it, the mere fact that it survives all of these criticisms, means that there's something useful there because it survived all attempts to criticize it. So it's a rational meme that tends to get propagated. The other kind of sticky meme is the anti-rational meme, which has the property that it disables a person's critical faculties. And by virtue of the fact that no one's now criticizing it, it survives as well and is also sticky and gets replicated.
Now, does Deutsch make a value judgment as to anti-rational memes are bad, or are there good anti-rational memes?
I think they're all bad because they frustrate our capacity to generate explanations more broadly.
It is one key distinction to have in mind, though, is that there's the idea and like what it says, and then there's the method of its discussion and how you treat that idea. So like if I just say, I think the historical example that sometimes comes up is like, I think the Pope said to Newton or somebody, maybe somebody knows the example, I can just make that the dogma of the church if you want. Right? He's like, no. So it's the same idea, but it's just saying like, hey, I want this to be discussed and criticized, not just like held up as like the right idea and everybody must believe it. So there's a difference between the substance and how you treat it.
Okay, yeah, that helps narrow it in. So my challenge, I guess, to you is, it's not necessarily a challenge, but maybe a complication, is the goal of street epistemology is to arm people with the tools to better rationally critique memes, right? Is that fair, or?
Yeah, to raise the sanity waterline, to help the general cultural be more rational.
Yes, which I 100% support, but I guess my question for you would be, what % of people adopt good memes on the basis of Socratic dialogue and rational analysis versus other mechanisms like imitating those around them, right? And you guys can weigh in on this too, but because I guess my critique would be, in the great meme war, there's many hundreds of millions of people at least in the United States and Western civilization more broadly, it's only a small minority of people who are amenable, who are even interested in these discussions to begin with, to even then be able to play the game that we're playing of rational kind of Socratic dialogue. So the question is, how much do ideas need to spread through means other than rational Socratic dialogue? I guess I'd throw that out there to any of you guys.
I definitely want all the rational memes to be spread in whatever means that is possible. I like film as well, YouTube, video production, any type of thing that captures people's attention. Hopefully the memes can be spread that way. But if there's conflicts between ideas and conflicts between groups in the culture, these ideas and arguments need to be hashed out rationally, ideally, to make progress. And you can maybe do that, with us just throwing videos or films at each other, but it's not as efficient as a conversation, hopefully.
This one idea that I had watching your video, kind of echoing some of the same points, is maybe not so much related to the conversation element as much as this question of like what percentage of people are interested in conversation and the abstract ideas, or who could understand it. And I guess something rubs me the wrong way about thinking there's the rational people who want to talk about ideas and everybody else. I think it's rational to be ignorant, as many political commentators will say. Like, if you don't have much chance of changing the outcome, maybe you should try to make more money for yourself and not get into politics. So I think there's a rational element to like how much you want to listen to some arbitrary idea. Some people only check Twitter once a week because they're like, hey, somebody else will have criticized it and I won't have wasted my time on it. And I think also like there's a place for like very powerful demonstrations of ideas. Like, you may not want to invest in SpaceX based on the pitch, but you might on the basis of their successful rocket launches. And so that's a perfectly rational thing to do. It's a reasonable thing to do, is say like, if I want to really get all the alpha in this investment, maybe I got to pay attention to the early pitches and be good at that. But if you say, I don't want to do that, I want it to be de-risked, and you show me a rocket working, and then we'll talk. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And it doesn't fit into this just arguments versus vibes. It's like, I want you to demonstrate something. So I think that's also a place for that. I think all these things can be legitimate choices.
Yeah, because my thesis in a nutshell would be, and this is derived from Jordan Peterson, Maps of Meaning, and Bret Weinstein's sort of theory of lineage selection, which I think he best outlined in his debate with Richard Dawkins, which we were talking about earlier. But essentially, human beings evolve because prior to becoming human, prior to developing the neocortex, right, where most of our human rationality is located or the processing happens, we were pre-rational. And yet we developed a huge base of knowledge, and not only knowledge like procedural knowledge of just how to walk and how to run, but social interaction, right? We know that primates are extremely social, very complex social hierarchies. Chimp politics is kind of what they call it, and it's probably more sophisticated than many of our politics often. But there's a great deal of information encoded in our, pre-rational mind or our sub-rational mind. And my thesis is the way that people are convinced is not the primary way that most people are convinced of ideas, and even people who describe themselves as being rationally interested in ideas, is not through the merits of an argument. I hear an argument, I hear a position, and then I evaluate the logic. Most of it is, do people that I find admirable, do people that I respect, do people that I find as high social status, like in the most primitive form, if we're in a chimp troop, the high social status individuals, what do they believe? I'm going to copy that belief. And that's a different epistemological mechanism than we're going to rationally evaluate ideas, because what gives someone social status is not necessarily their ability to articulate ideas. For people who we're interested in, I'm sure most people watching, that is kind of the person the people that we admire as being high social status. But like a good artist, a good person who's just very involved in their community, but doesn't know who Karl Marx is, doesn't know who most people know who Einstein is, but people who are not engrossed in the world of ideas can develop real social status for, I would say, valid reasons. Like if you're if you go to work 12 hours a day and you're a pillar of the community, there's something about the world that through your actions that you maybe can't articulate, that we've evolved to identify and want to imitate, more so than just, this person's able to rationally articulate a belief better or whatnot. And so I'm just curious what you guys maybe think of that as, because when I first heard that rational versus anti-rational dichotomy with Deutsch, my thought was, there's plenty of anti-rational memes that are good in that they're, unquestioning dogmas that someone like that might have. Is like, I I get up and I work 12 hours a day because God told me.
Just as a side point,
Yeah.
irrational and anti-rational are far from being the same thing. So irrational is a bad idea that you're talking about.
Okay.
Anti-rational has this active property of literally disabling your capacity to go on and generate knowledge,
Sure.
whether in a general sense or in certain specific cases as well. So by that metric, not concentrating on whether or not an idea is nonsense, irrational, but rather not merely nonsense, not merely false, but bad by the technical definition of prevents any progress from being made. And so Deutsch also has a distinction between false philosophy, for example, which is a dime a dozen, there's lots of false philosophy out there, and bad philosophy. And bad philosophy is philosophy which says you literally can't make any progress, so don't even bother trying. You know, a lot of the postmodernist relativist type stuff says, well, there is no truth, so, you know, no point. So that's a bad philosophy. It's not merely false, it's also bad because it frustrates our ability to be rational.
And just before I forget, this is a slightly different point. I guess we're just gonna all jump on what you said.
Please.
One thing that comes to mind, it's not a knockdown argument or anything, but just if people are basing their opinions on like status or something, you immediately run into a very practical problem when high status people disagree. So then you're kind of like, okay, now what do I do?
True.
So,
But don't you run the same problem with people who are completely rational disagreeing?
I'm just saying that if you're still left, what do I think? If the two people that I think are great and I want to emulate disagree, like you got to choose one, and so none of the criteria of status will make the distinction.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's that. I agree that is a real problem. I guess my point would be the rational articulation, the Socratic dialogue doesn't necessarily solve that, because I'm sure we can all think of examples of. There's plenty of perfectly rational people, especially nowadays. There's many controversial issues that we don't have to go into, but like there's many perfectly rational people that are on polar opposites of issues that each side would say is like it's actually not. This isn't like a debate about a theory of physics. Like this is a very clear moral issue, and yet these rational people are split, you know, almost entirely. And so you're correct that you don't want. The example I always go is like Cardi B interviewed Joe Biden, and it's like, well, we don't want Cardi B necessarily to be the kingmaker of our politics, but by the same token, that problem doesn't get solved with the strictly rational approach. And so maybe a question for you guys is, how do you deal with the fact, or what is your perception of the fact that, in the simplest sense, very intelligent people can disagree so strongly on issues which, again, are not like, it's not quantum physics, it's no, this is just obvious, and the fact that you disagree is almost goes into the realm of like you're immoral at this point or something.
Can I just say one thing real quick, which is I want to have like a statue of Karl Popper. We just tag team it, and he comes in and says one of his quotes, like in this case, like the truth is not obvious, and the idea that the truth is obvious is like the root of evil. I don't know if that was going to pop out of your head as well, but like that statement right there is already bad, because if you just say that the truth is not obvious, then we're all ready to sit down and be like, okay, we're going to make the assumption it's complicated. We're going to need to talk. I don't need to like immediately jump on you because you should see it, and if you don't, I think his thing was like, if you think the truth is obvious, then the person in front of you is either knows the truth and is lying, or they're too dumb to ever get it. And so not even worth talking to them. And both of these are the enemy of conversation.
Yeah, progress requires that we have very different approaches to what we think is true or good. So I would be surprised, in fact, I think it would be a bad thing if experts in different fields converged as a matter of rule or law or something like that. We want people to have disagreements and to be at polar opposites in certain circumstances. I don't know what you think about this, but when you were talking about that many people are not persuaded by Socratic dialogue, I agree with you, and I think that it's because of fundamentally differences in epistemology. The overwhelming majority of people don't talk epistemology. They don't talk the topics that street epistemology deals with. Every culture, every society began with an epistemology which was basically do what the authority says and believe what the authority believes. So if the priest believes it, if the chief of the tribe believes it, then so should you as well. And we mentioned before, empiricism and rationalism. Both of those were an escape from that way of thinking, because the empiricists said, hey, look, maybe the evidence is actually relevant to talk about it, rather than just saying the priests or the holy books got it. Maybe actually looking out into the world and conducting tests, comparing your ideas against reality. Maybe there's some merit to that idea. So that was an improvement. And the rationalists said, maybe the individual themselves can actually reason their way through things as well. That it's not just deferring to the experts, so to speak, that'll get you to the truth. You, by virtue of the fact you're a person, actually has access to knowledge, truth, reality, that kind of thing. And what Popper does and layers on top of that is an escape from both of those which have misconceptions, because he says evidence is relevant, but not in the way the empiricists say. The empiricists say all you need to do is to go outside and to look, and then you will absorb knowledge from reality, which is as if to say, and David Deutsch's famous example is, that would be as if to say you could look up at the sky at night, see those things that are twinkling in the sky, and somehow derive from the twinkling what a star really is. But of course the stars look cold, dim and small, and we know that they're hot, bright and vast. But how did we get there? Not simply by looking more and more and more. And so Popper has this entirely different epistemology which says the knowledge isn't out there, it comes from in here and it's tested out there. So this is kind of like a hierarchy of epistemologies, and so I am unsurprised that yes, people do in fact fall back on a kind of authoritarian, primitive way of understanding the world. And I've no doubt that, you know, we look at certain people, we want to emulate them. If the scientist says that X is true, then a whole bunch of people just think, well, therefore I must think that X is true as well because the scientist said it or the politician said it. Very few people go the next step to correct that by saying, well, I'm going to look at the evidence myself. And even fewer people then move to the Popperian point and go, well, it's not a mere matter of looking at the evidence, it's being able to understand the theory behind the evidence and being able to interpret the evidence and that kind of thing. So yeah, when they're doing street epistemology, it's at that high level of Socratic, let's interrogate your ideas in order to try and change them, but very few people are operating there. But you're trying to teach them that they can do it.
Yeah, which is a good thing. You want as many people who are capable of developing good Socratic habits to develop them. The question is, though, does that need to be supplemented with something else that's kind of entirely outside of that? And I think the answer is yes. You were going to say something?
Well, it's a slightly different thing. I was thinking like a kind of a fun, more just like a picture to have in mind sometimes about like what this is all about in some way. Is like, imagine that you have a system and you sprinkle a bunch of errors in it, and then your hope is that the system works in such a way that it eventually gets back to the right answers. And so just imagine that you have all the high status people, the whatever, all this stuff, the president of some company or a country. So imagine you sprinkle errors and like suddenly they're thinking wrong thoughts because you sprinkled them on there. You hope that they're surrounded by people and discussions where like that weird cosmic ray that hit their brain gets corrected and they don't press the nuclear button. Or as new ideas get spread into the system that are covering a wide area, that they eventually converge on the truth. These are the sort of general properties you want. And so if you have a street epistemology or a culture of going to scientific conferences and not like talking over somebody, you have to let them speak and these kinds of things. These are all one way of saying, hey, new stuff is happening, errors are happening, and we want these things to converge on the truth. Because if you said, what if we just sprinkle some errors on the president and nobody's allowed to say anything to him? It's just Kim Jong-un or somebody. Right. Well, that he may push the button.
Yeah. Well, a good question that might explore some of this more is, I don't know I want to know your guys' opinions, but I don't know what Deutsch's opinions are on religion. Does Deutsch take, and do you guys take the view that religion by and large is sort of a mind virus, primitive, kind of if you ask too many questions, you'll go to hell, that type of anti-rational dismantling of faculties. Is religion by and large that, a meme complex like that? Or do you guys think that, and this would be the Bret Weinstein sort of Jordan Peterson perspective, that religions are compendiums of evolutionary wisdom, where religions that have existed, in their prehistoric forms, going back tens of thousands of years, if not more, prior to being written down, cave paintings, it's like, do we consider those religious? It's not obvious. But if those traditions existed over a long period of time, had the force of selection, acting against them, it weeded out those traditions that were not conducive to human flourishing per se, and as a side point, I would say maybe some of that anti-rationality is actually part of that, that there are certain dogmas we just have that, we shouldn't question whether it's okay to murder a child in some, you can get into the trolley problem type stuff, but even that's sort of like the kind of person who is interested in the questions about the trolley problem is a very small subset of people, right? And so maybe you do need the somewhat anti-rational aspect of like, let's just not question these things in terms of, and there's worse examples I could use that I won't go into. But my point is, I subscribe to the hypothesis that religion is it's a compendium of evolutionary wisdom that is sort of like an external computer almost. It's like, well, we don't have to rationalize through a lot of these things because, a lot of these questions have been answered, and the problems in religion are, obviously ancient problems, personal problems that people deal with all the time. And so I'm just curious I don't know what Deutsch thinks on it, but then also what do you guys think?
I can't speak for Deutsch, but the closest I can remember is an interview he did 15 years ago plus, possibly, and someone did ask him explicitly about his view on religion broadly, and he said, words to the effect, can't quote him, he rejected the supernatural stuff, so, Jesus wasn't performing miracles, there wasn't a burning bush. However, beyond that, he didn't have a problem with religion, so to speak. But I guess what we get out of the beginning of Infinity and what Deutsch's written work is that, yes, a religion is going to be a memeplex of a kind, and it has survived, the ones that exist through to today, because it contains useful information. Knowledge is instantiated in those religious traditions in much the same way as nation states and political systems contain within them knowledge, inexplicit knowledge about how to keep a society peaceful, how to ensure progress continues, and there's an open-ended stream of knowledge creation possible within those ideas. So I think the most modern version, and Deutsch talks about this, are things like the Westminster Parliament system, or modern democracies like the United States. They are systems that allow for human flourishing. And religions are kind of like that, but different in a sense, because within the framework of a political system, what you have is the capacity to remove the leaders and the people making the rules. And so that's the key feature of a lot of these political systems, is our capacity to change the knowledge that they're producing. Now, a religion is somewhat different in the sense that, well, there are certain kind of rituals one needs to go through. Now, are all of those rituals and are all of the practices in religion conducive to human flourishing? Some are, some aren't.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, for sure. There are definitely some that are not. On that point, it's sort of like a type 1, type 2 error problem, where, like you said, the parliamentary system has kind of the rational meme advantage of it, is we can discuss it, we can evaluate, it's written down, we can sub out the leaders. So that clearly has an advantage. But then you could reverse it and say, well, because that system is relatively new, evolutionary selection pressures have not had enough time to act on it for us to say reasonably, this is something that is adaptive over the long term. Whereas religions do have that feature, right? And so I guess if it is the case that religions contain this anti-rational aspect, the disabling of certain critical faculties to question things, right? The priesthood knows what they're doing, so on and so forth. How can religions, and I don't know if you believe this yourself or yourselves, but how can religions be on the whole, I guess I would ask Deutsch, why wouldn't you have a broader problem with religion if part of the religion, that's not even the supernatural stuff, but just the structure of it, the anti-rational aspect, we don't question this, you don't blaspheme or something like that. Why wouldn't that be negative overall, right? If it contains the anti-rational parts of it.
One thing to go back to that and sort of the general thing about religion is, I think that the conversation in my head about religion in sort of the Christopher Hitchens and all these debates kind of thing, my view of it is kind of like, oh, it's bad. Okay, there you go. But I think and going into a lot of the detailed claims and so on. So I think that's one kind of picture. And then I think what I got from reading Deutsch was a bit more of a nuanced thing in two ways. One is that if you look at religion and just say, oh, it's all wrong, you'd be missing any cultural things that are good. And so like some people are like cultural Jews or whatever, they say there's good stuff here, I want to keep that. So you'd be missing that element. You'd say there could be some bad stuff, but some good stuff too. Secondly, you'd be missing the fact that there are other ideas which no one would call religion per se, but have the worst features of any given religion, which is the anti-rational bit. So you'd be missing the good stuff in existing sets of ideas that go into the heading of religion, and B, you might be unaware of the other much more evil ideas that are anti-rational. And so you could say of today of like cultural war stuff or something that like if we go into a conversation and we hit a certain topic and then suddenly nobody wants to say the wrong thing because it could go wrong, that is exactly the same problem as being, okay, there's a dogma here, I'm gonna get put on the stake if I say the wrong thing. It's the same error. And if you were only anti-religion, you would miss the more general error, which is the anti-rational, the cooling of conversation. You're not allowed to talk about certain things. So I think that's kind of my two-part lesson from the Deutsch verse, which says, don't throw out all the ideas as bad, and also be aware the evil is not just a religious thing. Yeah.
And yeah, obviously, religions are going to be different, not merely one from another, but from themselves at different points in history as well. So it's clear to me at the moment that your typical jihadist, Islamist take on Islam is going to be one of the preeminent examples of the way in which to almost ensure a static society filled with anti-rational memes. If you dare contravene any of the teachings of Muhammad, let's say, we're not merely going to punish you, we are going to eradicate you from the face of the earth. We'll burn you, we'll kill you, we'll rape your daughters, hell on earth. Now that is quite a different picture than what you get from, let's say, modern Anglicanism, where there is a black and white difference between the Islamist who says over and again, we love death more than you love life, and certain kinds of Christianity, which are very much a celebration of life. And we were talking about this yesterday, that what you get from, certainly from Deutsch, is a repositioning of humanity and people, not in a superstitious religious way, but in a very scientific, rational way, as being at the center of the universe in some sense. Not physically in the center of the universe, but a unique place in the universe where knowledge is being generated. And so that's why I say, like, what religions had quite right, almost across the board, minus the Islamist, is the sacredness of humanity, the sacredness of the person, the importance of the person, putting a person on the pedestal. Now, can you have that without religion? And we say yes, because unlike other rationalists who say human beings are just a slightly more intelligent ape, or if you're Bret Weinstein, we're just an LLM. We're saying no. We are black and white, categorically different to every other animal that has walked this earth, and it certainly exists now, and every other computer system. And also, in fact, we go further. We say that people are in fact even more significant than what any traditional religion has ever said, because over time we can become more like gods. We can take control of entire continents, the entire planet, eventually the solar system, and that is approaching what people's conception of what a divine, almost all-powerful being would be.
But I suppose the in the jihadist example is a good example, because Islam is particularly, has in Christianity you have the separation of church and state. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. You can see very clearly the theological kind of articulation of it that manifests in political philosophy. In Islam, it's the opposite. It's like the schools of the political philosophy is, the Quran is literally a text that's cited in like political philosophy. Okay, so that's one end, the dogma. But then the other end is what happens if you have no dogma and everything is up for debate, everything's up for questioning? That's like the postmodernist problem of like, well, all categories, there are no taboos, everything is acceptable, all previous traditions, all dogma in and of itself is bad. And it seems like there's a middle ground of, you need some dogma, you need some anti-rational disabling of faculties as like again, going back to and this is, I don't know, may or may not be a good way, way to conceptualize it, but like, I think of to go back to the high social status individual that people admire. It's like the guy that wakes up at 5 a.m. and works 12 hours a day and goes to church and doesn't, like, it keeps society alive. It's like that person is more, the ideas of that person and how they get acted out are more valuable, are more good in some fundamental sense than the college student who's super smart, but all he does is pontificate or whatnot, and so forth, like in the postmodern kind of sense. And so like the dogmatic aspect of the belief system of the person who just follows the tradition as it was is rational in some fundamental sense, right? Versus, well, if we have no taboos, if dogma itself is bad, then we just end up in the postmodern questioning everything. How do we avoid that?
Well, I wouldn't describe the problem there as being like you question too much. That's not the problem. The problem is that your criteria aren't very good. So once you have a bunch of ideas, then you got to talk about which ones are good. And if you don't do that, or you have a bad set of criteria, then okay, things are bad. But I mean, the religious guy who's stuck may seem good for now, but then as soon as you say, hey, what if we want to like not all be dying all the time? What if we went the transhumanist route of having minds on new bodies? And they say, oh, religion doesn't allow that. Well, then we're going from a situation where we want to go from everybody is going to die for sure, with the human setup, the bodies we have, to one where, oh, we could be immortal. And suddenly, now that person who's very, very conventional doesn't see that the important things that matter are preserved in this new setup, despite the fact that it looks different. And so suddenly that's the worst idea in the world. They're condemning everyone on Earth to death when we could avoid it.
Interesting, but even that is like, I would agree with that guy. The only fate worse than hell, the only fate worse than dying is living forever.
You don't have to live as long as you want. It's just saying you get to press the button when you want.
Yeah, but
so
we wouldn't have to get into the exact, but
yeah.
I guess to the broader point of where do you get the criteria by which you evaluate what is a good idea or not? Because it's like, we have this belief that, everyone is equal, everyone deserves equal rights and equal consideration and equal moral worth. That's not rational. Where does that come from?
But you mentioned dogma, and the dogmatist and the relativist or the postmodernist are identical in one respect. The dogmatist will say, I cannot possibly be wrong because, hey, I've got the truth, so I'm going to be committed to my dogma. The relativist will say, also, I cannot be wrong because there is no being wrong, right?
Yes.
So this is why we describe ourselves, or I describe myself as a fallibilist. A fallibilist is someone who's neither dogmatic nor postmodern, but who says there is something to be wrong about, and you could possibly be wrong about it all the time. There is no exception to that rule, but there's a reality out there, and I could be wrong about it. And so Deutsch says the thing he vacillates between is he a dogmatist on this point or not, about do not destroy the means of error correction. Yeah. That's the one thing that he says he's committed to, but if you start to doubt that, then there's no possibility for progress. So what you call dogmas, maybe I would just say are foundational ideas, but I could be wrong about them. But I'm willing to take seriously certain deep foundational ideas.
Can I challenge that? Actually, I'll
actually, no.
No. Perfect example.
Dogma, don't
right there, yeah. I'll borrow from my presuppositionalist associates that I don't like on a lot of respects, but they have some good points that they make. Can you be? You said you're a sorry, could you define fallibilist? Fallibilist.
Someone
again?
who thinks that there's something to be wrong about, and they could be wrong about it.
And you take that position for any belief you hold? Literally
anything, yeah. I could be wrong, even if I can't imagine.
What about suffering is bad? Endless. So this is where Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris sort of, I think, butted heads the most in their discussion a few years ago on the Pangburn philosophy debates. It's like, I believe like that actually it's hard for me to intuit that, because the idea that, for example, suffering for no higher purpose or suffering for the sake of satisfying someone else's malevolence, that is never good. In that sense, I'd be dogmatic about that. Or inflicting needless suffering on someone else. Inflicting suffering on another conscious being for my own gratification. That's something that is that I would be dogmatic about, and I'm curious.
It's a good idea, and I would, I was also saying this, I would defend to the death a whole bunch of things. I would defend to the death, the nation state in order to protect it from an invasion by China, all that sort of stuff. That doesn't make me a dogmatist, even though I'm willing to fight with my life for certain ideas.
Okay.
Now, the reason for that is it's just like 1 + 1 = 2, right? Could I be wrong about that? I think I could be wrong about that. Now, I can't imagine how I could possibly be wrong about that. Yeah. Same as, endless suffering for all time for everyone. Could that possibly be a good thing? I can't imagine how it could possibly be a good thing. But I'm a fallible human being. So it could just be a failure of my imagination to figure out how I could be wrong about this. But I'm not saying I am wrong.
That's what Satan would say.
Yeah.
Listen, Jesus, actually, hell might be pretty cool.
but-
to
but-
rule
I'm gonna have to
over.
add that to my vocabulary. That's what Satan would
That's what
say.
Satan would say.
Conceding that there's a possibility one could be wrong about absolutely anything does not weaken the argument, I don't think.
Interesting, but your point about there are beliefs that you hold, even though you recognize the beliefs are fallible, you would die for them, theoretically, or I mean in practice, right?
And you
Or
only know which
whatever it is.
ones because you've compared the options.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes, but and this is just I guess a definitional thing. It's interesting because that would make you identical to the dogmatist of. You're just adding. You're saying you and the dogmatist would both say I'm going to die for this belief, even though
Because I think the dogmatist is wrong. When they say that they truly believe this 100% or something like that, and they can't possibly, I don't believe them because they can't know. They can't know
Yeah.
that it's absolutely
totally
true.
yes, that's like the flaw of fundamentalism is even if theoretically you had a book that had all of the correct answers about reality, you're still a fallible human. So the probability that your interpretation of that book is correct is, zero.
Deutsch actually has a great essay on this, which is like, you could even assume that the Pope is infallible, but you would never be able to know that you had infallibly seen the Pope being infallible.
Yeah.
So that you can even assume the
Right.
Pope is infallible and it still gets you nothing.
Right.
Yeah, it's the argument from, I think they call it in Catholicism, ex cathedra. So when the Pope is sitting on his throne and it's under certain particular conditions and he's dressed in all his regalia and whatever else, and then he issues his, papal
Pronouncements or whatever.
directive, whatever it happens to be, then it is canon law, it's absolute truth that has to be believed by all Catholics. Now, Deutsch has the story of, imagine you witnessed this, you were at the Vatican and you saw him dressed up in his regalia and he says something, and perhaps he says something absurd like 1 + 1 = 3, and as a committed Catholic you now supposedly have to walk away from that believing that 1 + 1 = 3. Now, the problem with that is, as Deutsch points out, is maybe what you just saw, despite the fact he sets it up as if you've just seen it, was a rehearsal for the following day where they just inserted the words 1 + 1 = 3 in place of the actual thing they were going to say. So you can never possibly rule out all the other theories that might explain what's right in front of your eyes. And so that's
Right.
true for all ideas that you have. So like to say, seeing is not believing. Even if you see it happen right in front of your face, you could still be wrong.
Right. And I would say this is the classic Peterson line that he gets raked over the coals for, that I happen to agree with greatly, is what you believe is what you act out, right? And so that's why I said, in the sense that, this is a strong claim, in the sense that matters most, maybe, the dogmatist and the person who's willing to die for their beliefs while still admitting that it could be wrong. It's like, I mean, I've talked to priests and pastors who certainly admit, they don't know. There's all kinds of even for the clergy or whatever. There's all kinds of unanswered questions. They are more dogmatic about other. It's for sure God, and that even for me, I'm like, I have that same perspective. Kind of towards them. It's like, how do you know? It's just that certainty. There's conversations I can't have with them that I can have with people like you guys, because there is not that dogma in that particular place. But that doesn't rule out the probability or the possibility that religious systems, a moral system that is conducive to human flourishing, may require some level of anti-rational, like disabling the faculties of reason. Do you guys agree with that? Or is it sort of an axiom that no, we are making progress the more that we eliminate anti-rational elements of a meme complex?
I think if you zoom out and take an interesting perspective, it's again like that error sprinkle test. So imagine that the God is real or something, but again, you don't know that everything that you've gotten is correct. So I like to almost imagine, again, this is zooming out maybe too far, but I think that if you look at a culture that stays the same and it sort of is working in some sense, anybody who wants to change something that's working needs to be like, you're not gonna break the whole thing, are you? Like somebody wants to change
You better have a
something.
good reason for it, yeah.
that's always the fear if you have something that is working more or less as a culture or whatever, or in genetic evolution, everything is trying to stay the same. Every gene is trying to stay the same. That is the thing. With humans, you get this whole other picture, which is very unintuitive in a certain sense, which is like, I have something here that's kind of working. It seems like you should just keep it the same. Don't fix what ain't broken. And yet you want to change something. And I know you could destroy everything if you change it. Like, this actually works, and there's other versions of it that don't work at all. So you want to come and change something. That you shouldn't allow that in some sense. You have to be conservative. So there's a certain obviousness to that.
That's the religious dogma kind of. That's what they're hitting on when
and there's a certain truth to it, which is that this has got some good stuff here, and you could change it and destroy the whole damn thing. So why should I let you change anything? So that's a strong case for conservatism in that sense. But then you say, well, there's error sprinkles, there's new situations happening. You don't necessarily have what it takes to deal with a plague or something. So you're gonna die eventually if you don't have what it takes to do those things. So you have to be like, how do I get change without losing the good stuff? How do I get change without shooting myself in the foot? Somebody gives you a new idea as a gun, and you're like, okay, how do I do this where I'm killing something and I can eat it, as opposed to like, I'm shooting myself in the face, which you could so easily do. So that's where this whole picture of discussion comes in. Hey, I have a new idea for a weapon. Okay, well, let's discuss whether it's gonna blow up the world first. Let's simulate it. There's all sorts of things like that where you wanna have some way of allowing novelty so you can handle new situations and fix old errors, but not die, destroy everything that's good. So that's the fundamental dichotomy.
The example of the error sprinkling, and then assume that's the case, what is the mechanism for that? But did you want to respond to?
I was just going to say, so the suggestion I'm hearing is that are there some dogmas which we might require in order to enable human flourishing? But is that substantively different to saying, are there just some important ideas that are required for human flourishing? I can agree with that. There are some deep, important bits of knowledge that we've gathered over time, religious, political, etc., basically Enlightenment ideas, that allow for knowledge creation, problem solving, and that kind of thing. Now, if you replace that notion of there are these ideas that are important to preserve and that help maintain civilization and individual flourishing, if you replace that with, well, there are these dogmas, all that you're doing is saying there are certain ideas that cannot possibly be improved upon, that we'll never discover anything which would allow us to build upon this idea, refute this idea, replace it with something better. Whereas in the first idea is that there are some ideas out there that allow for human flourishing. That at least allows for the possibility that whatever those ideas are, let's say free speech, for example, is a good example. We can come to we all want to, most of us enlightened people want to preserve free speech or the ability to express ourselves freely, whatever you want to call it. But we can always come to a deeper understanding of that. It's not like that as a static dogma, because people interpret it in different ways. And moreover, I would hope that 100 years from now, more enlightened people still, more knowledgeable people, have an even deeper understanding of what free speech really entails. They'll preserve free speech, but they will know more about it than what we know now.
Not allow like violence and say like incitement to violence, etc. Like that's like, if you're not an expert on it, you're like, hey, shouldn't you let them say what they want to say? And you're like, actually, there's a reason to not. You can ask the question: is it curtailing free speech to be like, I can't tell everybody in the country to kill you and give them your address?
Correct.
Right. If the mafia don, if I'm the mafia don, and I say to you, go and kill him right now, it's an exercise of my free speech. But I tell you what, it's also a crime.
Right. Well, and that would be, I suppose, in some sense, that would be the dogma that the free exchange of ideas is necessary for human flourishing. And that's something I would die for, you would die for, ideally, in theory, I'd like to think so. I suppose that's sort of and Jordan Peterson would say that's the central idea in Christianity, is associating divinity with the logos, right? Jesus is the logos in the Bible. Logos being the root of logic. It's
this is not exactly the point, but I associate divinity with the Legos.
The Legos, yeah, right. Well, there's good ones. You can build I'm sure there's some 50,000 piece cathedrals that you can build out of Legos, but I guess just the point I'm making, or I guess the way I'm using the words is, that I would call that dogma in some sense of, I dogmatically believe that anyone who says we cannot discuss ideas that are necessary to kind of orient society, that's a problem. Although I will admit what I just said earlier, like there's certain things that I don't think we actually should be like discussing. There are certain ideas that the proper response to them is not, let's have a discussion about it. It's, you're an idiot. This is weird. This is pathetic. This is lame. And that might sound, might sound anti-intellectual in some sense, but it's like, again, I won't go into what ideas those are, but I think people might intuit some of those. It's a lot of what the postmodernists like to play with or whatnot. But I believe that dogma is necessary. Of course, it needs to be balanced. Everything's a type 1, type 2 error kind of trade-off in some sense. But yeah, go ahead.
So I think one thing that, if I'm understanding you right, I would reframe what you're thinking of as like, hey, this is a really good idea. Everybody who wants to mess with that, I got a problem with that, because this is really important. This is kind of the thing that makes it all run. And if you mess this up, I think we're all in a bad situation. I would call that taking the idea seriously. And so to me, it's not so much like you can't come for it. It's just like, I'm going to invest everything into proving you wrong about this thing, because I think it's super important. I will drop everything to debate you on this, to show you wrong, and I'm not going to invest in this. Every tool I have at my disposal, I'm going to try to prevent you messing up this very important and true idea. So to me...
Only through debate or through any means necessary?
Well, if the Nazis come down, you have to do what you have to do. Yeah. But anyway, to me, the problem you're raising, and I think what I'm trying to try to give an answer to it, is that some things need to be taken seriously because they're precious. And so I think that the question is, how do you do that? You might say, don't let anybody touch that thing or mess with it or even ask about it. Let's not even talk about it.
We'll call anyone a name and shame people that try to...
But I think there's an alternative way, which is more powerful, to achieve the same thing of saying, hey, this is valuable, we want to keep it, is to say, I know exactly why it's valuable. You're going to have to cross these 10 hurdles to get me to buy this idea, because this idea has this good thing, this good thing, this good thing. And I know, because I have talked about it and I have thought about it, and I know why it's good. I know all the things around it that aren't good, and I know why they're bad. So I'm going to say, run this obstacle course. And it's a hard obstacle course. And if you want to come to me with a new Einstein thing, Einstein got 100 things right. So show me that you got those 100 things right, or go home. And you got to run this course. That's different from saying, don't touch my precious.
Right.
But it takes the idea seriously. I think that's the core thing.
And this relates to your point earlier about what happens if you have a system, you sprinkle errors in it, what's the error correcting mechanism? Going back to the way I think about ideas is they're ideas that we can hold in our heads and discuss in conversation. But an idea is held when you act it out, right? So if I believe that lying is wrong, it's like that, you can believe that conceptually. It's different to then act it out by actually not lying, right? And so...
Most of your ideas you never act out, by the way.
True, yeah. The most important ones you do, I would say. The idea, well, most important by, what lens. Going back to we're in a meme war, right? Like the war of culture and war of ideas going on, let's say in the West. Those are the ideas that we act out, right? It's like, well, then what political policy are we going to implement? What social norms should we have? So, and maybe that's just cope because I'm not, I don't understand when Eric Weinstein talks about rulers and protractors in 13 dimensions. So I'm like, I can't act those out, so those are not as important. But, you can obviously build incredible technology and stuff. But, sorry, the point on the error correcting mechanism, good ideas, when you act them out, produce a positive outcome. That would be sort of my definition of it. So like the person who just wakes up in the morning, prays, works for 12 hours a day, and says, I'm never going to lie, or I'm never going to cheat on my wife, or something like that. It's like, well, it's like, well, but, monogamy is a social construct, and if, in the moment, maybe something, it's like, sometimes a dogmatic adherence to an idea that you act out, the results of acting it out are the proof of its veracity, so to speak. Not the logical coherence in an abstract sense, but what happens if you have this idea and you live your life by it?
It's tough because you start adding 2 and 2 and you get 4, and then you go and do something, and then you get injured. You're like, 2 + 2 isn't 4. It led to a bad
right?
thing.
Yes, it's obviously it's not just well, I thought this and I drank water and then this happened, so water must be bad. Yes, there are nuances to it, but I mean, our ideas. How can an idea be important if it doesn't have implications for action?
Well, like the whole of mathematics is like this. I guess you could say that abstract mathematics, despite being very remote, affects mathematicians who want to think about it. But their whole thing is, you ain't going to build anything with this. It's just beautiful. and there's still coherence there, and so on, and it's worthwhile. And sometimes eventually it turns out there's some use, but they don't care about that per se.
Interesting. I would think, and maybe you're referring to, you're talking about like pure theoretical mathematics or whatnot, because obviously like math and physics creates all the technology that we use.
Yeah, but like famously, mathematicians and physicists will come to each other and say like, there's this vast world of mathematics, and then like this tiny corner is like what applies to our physical world of like three-dimensional reality or a 4D space-time or something. And they're like, dude, we came up with so many other wild things that no physicist has ever used. So,
Interesting.
They can never predict, though, of course. They can never
Yeah, it
prophesy.
doesn't have
like
predictive power. Right?
Well, I was going to say, G.H. Hardy, who wrote A Mathematician's Apology, he was the mathematician that brought Ramanujan to England, and he famously says in that book that a whole lot of his mathematics, or in fact all of his mathematics, I think he wanted to say was completely useless. It was basically the equivalent of abstract art. No one will ever use this, and he was proud of the fact that it had no practical application. I think within a decade or so of his death, it started being used in certain fields, certain parts of electronics and stuff. So even mathematicians, when they say, this is all useless, no one's ever going to use this, they can't predict, the content of future explanations and how people might apply their own stuff.
yeah, but yeah, but the mathematical universe is big, and so they would say like we have mathematical structures which correspond to like infinitely many dimensions. We have one for 5, we have one for 6, and you guys are just using 3 and 4 or whatever. He's like, we have so many more things. Maybe you'll use them, maybe you won't. But the mathematical universe is vast, and it isn't empirically tested or something. It's more of this coherence.
How do they know it's true then? Just because it follows logically?
Well, yeah, like they have. I guess the traditional thing is to have a set of axioms, and you think, okay, these rules on those axioms make sure that everything I derive is true, and so and you test that on things maybe that are more empirical that and you have arguments to say that these axioms are good and these rules are good, and then hey, you have a random mathematical idea and say, I think this might be true. You see if you can work it out from the axioms.
Although we might want to be careful with true there, because of course the truth of your conclusion is only going to have as much truth as whatever your axioms that you started with. So your axioms might very well be false. One of my favourite lines out of The Fabric of Reality that I'm forever quoting is where David says of mathematics itself, necessary truth is the subject matter of mathematics. It is not the reward we get for doing mathematics. In other words, even in mathematics, you don't get the truth. You get knowledge of the truth. And it's the same in physics and everywhere else. So we tend not to talk in terms of, we found the truth, this is the truth, that's the truth. Truth is an abstract property of propositions in a technical sense. What we get is something kind of better, knowledge, because knowledge we can continue to build on and create and whatever. The truth is completely and utterly unchanging, and we can come to an understanding of it, but we'll never get there. And kind of thank God, because it means the future is infinitely interesting as we uncover more and more and more truth, eliminating more and more error, and getting further away from utter complete falsity towards something which has got more truth in it, although we can't quantify the amount of truth in any of the claims that we have. I don't know if that has any bearing on
it. Yeah. Well, do you have any thoughts that have come up during this? Because I can take it in a different direction, but.
Yeah, you basically asked, is Christianity knowledge in the Popperian sense? I think it's part of part of our evolutionary process of getting knowledge. It solved a lot of problems, but I think it's like humanity's moral training wheels, metaphysics training wheels. But we're past the spark of the Enlightenment. We can now use these more rational ways of getting at morality, physics, whatever we want to think about, aesthetics, art. I'm sure Christianity and religion will be with us for a long time. It's just going forward, there's progress to be made. And Bret Weinstein also says we're in a hyper-novel situation where a lot of errors are probably being sprinkled much faster than we have had them sprinkled in the past as, civilization. So we need an error correction philosophy process to make sure we have rapid, stable change through this rapid novelty situation we're in. So this is the set of ideas that I'd like for the meme war to spread. So that's what I'm in a war to protect and get going.
Yes. Okay. We can form a coalition. It'll be a confederation. We won't merge kingdoms, but we'll form a military alliance. That's good. Mm-hmm.
Can I pick up on, because
Sure.
Reid says something absolutely crucial, which is that religions solved problems. You know, prior to organised religion, of course, internecine, tribal warfare, constant killing, genocides, it was awful. And so organised religion solved the problem of how to organise society, how to allow individuals to flourish within the confines of those constraints. And a lot of the problems that it solved haven't yet been improved upon by other things that have come along. But of course, a lot have. You know, the cosmology that's given to you in the Old Testament has been superseded by modern cosmology. But yeah, as I say, you know, the sacredness of the human being is something we still want to preserve. The commandments contain, you know, ancient wisdom, which again is a solution to the problem of tribes just killing one another. Hey, here's a list of things that you might want to try and preserve because this will help you flourish. So, yeah, I agree with you that religions are complex memeplexes that contain a whole bunch of knowledge, including inexplicit knowledge about how to keep things stable. Deutsch's thing as well, you know, with political systems, and I think it applies to religions as well, is that our circumstance is precarious in a sense of we want to make progress, but progress is change, and that is inherently unstable. So things can fall to ruin pretty quickly if society becomes unstable. So you want systems that allow for rapid progress while maintaining stability, and they're very hard won. And I think organised religions possibly serve a primitive purpose of allowing for that. But I think, you know, modern political systems are even better. It doesn't mean, by the way, we can articulate these things. That's why I say inexplicit knowledge. It's not like you can write down, here's the recipe for ensuring political progress and stability at the same time. There's a lot of good refutations of that. You know, try and impose democracy on Afghanistan. Look what happens. Because even we in the West that benefit from an enlightened society with a modern political system still don't understand how the thing works. We've got some ideas. We know basically what's going on, but to actually try and, you know, take a template and put it somewhere else where there hasn't been that long tradition of progress and error correction, you end up with disaster.
I think like the Popperian or Deutschian kind of term is like a tradition of criticism. That kind of goes back to what I said before of like, he talks about the tradition element is like keeping things the same, but then the criticism element is like, hey, what you got right now isn't so good, let's change it. It's like, there's an interesting yin and yang to that, which is what I mentioned before of like, hey, you have a good thing, you don't want to just blow it up, but then hey, maybe it can't handle everything, so you're gonna have to change it eventually. How do you get both of these things at the same time? And in terms of cultural invention, coming up with a way to do that. This is like this sort of epoch-making invention of like, how do you get to keep the good stuff? How do you say like, this idea is really good, let's make it a dogma almost, let's take it seriously. How do you do that, but also get the new stuff? And I think, I'm not a historian, but it seems like they would argue that like, it only happened once. Plenty of people had some good ideas here and there, but they never made the stability with the change. So that's a weird, like people have converged on lots of things and biology converges on eyes and everything, but this thing is a weird alien cultural technology in a way where it's like change plus keeping the good stuff.
Yeah. And you know, to the point, again, I'm Christian adjacent, not a Christian fundamentalist.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Christian
And the way I kind of conceptualize it is you have a system, there's parts of it that have been working. The fact that we're here historically means it's been working so far. So in order to have it be stable.
For some definition of work, yeah.
Correct, right. Right.
Killing and burning a lot of witches.
Yeah, exactly. Working in some sense, right? So we need to preserve some of it. But the environment, as we move forward, the environment's always changing. It's, you know, it's a car. It's like, okay, we got here, we drove here, but like we're gonna need to be able to turn left and turn right and change, you know, outer wheels or something like that as we move forward because the environment is constantly changing, it's unpredictable. So it needs to be...
Yeah, like you're driving towards a wall and the wall's like the sun's gonna explode and in a couple of years or whatever. So it's like,
right.
You're gonna get the sun's gonna
that one...
At least that's the farthest.
Do a lot of drugs if the sun's gonna explode in a few years. That might be the best way, we don't know. But exactly to that point, it's like, that balance of transformation while still retaining the things that worked is key. Now, just the way that I would conceptualize this is, I call it convergent memetic evolution. So biological evolution, you have divergent and convergent evolution, right? Divergent evolution species, develops a trait, and then every descendant of that species has that same trait, right? So I think whales have the same tailbone structure as humans in some sense that like fish don't have. So like sharks, their tails go side to side. Mammals go up and down because it's more reflective. So that's a divergent evolutionary process. Convergent evolution is when you have different species all converge on the same phenotype.
Wings,
so like
for
wings,
example.
birds, bats, and insects all converged on wings separately. You can apply that same logic, and we can say with divergent evolution, that's more likely to be spandrels, right? Well, this thing happened and it just happened to spread. Okay, we can't really infer much about its fitness. But with convergent evolution, we can say, okay, there's something about a wing that is objective in that it provides fitness or something like that. Yeah. The same.
You have to distinguish between like fitness in one area, and the thing about flight is that it's just useful in many areas. So like even if I have an adaptation that is only useful here, it could be the way to win in this environment that happens to be weird. But then it happens that flight is useful in that one and that one and that one, all these different niches.
Right.
So either way, like, if they're surviving in their niche, then they must be pretty good. But the convergent element just tells you kind of the reach of that thing. Like flight is useful in a lot of places.
Yes. So that's exactly how I would look at religion, as religions are the result of convergent memetic evolution, where you can have divergent memetic evolution, so like the Protestant Reformation, right? Martin Luther posted his HR complaint or whatever to the Catholic Church, and then from there, Protestantism spread. So we can say Protestantism is a result of divergent memetic evolution. But when you look at like the more deeper religious ideas from, that people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell would have, been studying, the hero's journey, the monomyth that appears in all these other myths. It's like, how is it that across the world, separated by time and space, all of these different brains, all these different tribes, all these different civilizations and societies, all converged on the same story structure?
But did they? Or I guess the story structure is one thing.
Yes, of course, the question is to what degree did it actually converge? There's obviously very significant differences in religion. There's differences in Protestantism and Catholicism, right? Even though they're and they historically have killed each other a lot over those. Right, yeah, one could say. But so it all depends on what the relative thing you're looking at. But like, I believe a look at the general, like someone who does comparative religion, I think would be hard pressed to deny that there is a very clear similarity from the Inuit tribe to the Sri Lankan tribe, where the Inuit might obviously, because they evolved in their society evolved in a tundra, and the Sri Lankans in a hotter ocean area. The nature of their stories are going to be somewhat different, but the underlying pattern is going to be similar in that the moral lessons it imparts, like care for your brother, care for your children, stuff like that. Venerate the the mother and the father and stuff like that.
Some of these ultimately, if it's just like if the rule is kill everyone all the time, then it's just that's going to die out.
Exactly. So
there's a little bit
right.
of that,
Yeah. So but that's my point is we can say, because we can infer or assume that because all of these societies converged on this, to the degree that different religions converge on the same underlying pattern, there's something true about those patterns that are in the, that acting them out provides an advantage, right? And that is how I view religions, as sort of the compendiums of wisdom that are passed down. But it's not just something that, happenstance, we developed it. It's like there's a set of patterns of behaviors out there. It's like optimal game theory, right? It's like you can establish the rules of a system, and then you only through constant iterations through the system do you find out what the optimal strategy is, like tit for tat, right? And then you can change the system and then different strategies emerge. It's like reality is a system. The social interactions are the game. Thousands or tens of thousands or millions, depending how far you look back at it, of years of time has passed where humans went through that system engaging in social strategies, and we came up with these stories, the hero's journey, whatever you want to call it. And that's I suppose that's the more rationalistic kind of analysis of the good elements of religion are those that are the deepest. The good elements of religion are those that are the deepest and have been around the longest. And to the point of, go ahead.
I was going to say, to the extent there is convergence, which it may be a little bit dubious, but that's a factual question.
Yeah.
explaining that somehow could be an interesting thing. I would also just say like X kind of philosophy has been around a long time, isn't as good like a flex as one might think, because they're sort of keeping their situation the same all the time. Like sharks have been the same for like a long time, whatever. Not that impressive in a certain sense, because what you would really like to have is is an idea which is like surviving in many different situations, is like subjected to many different tests over time. So if you just say like, hey, they've thought about like, hey, goats are great, is this cultural idea, and they've just thought that for 1,000 years, 10,000 years, I'm not that impressed by that. What I'm more impressed by is the fact, I think Deutsch talks about like what's a good idea for spreading, an idea that has a lot of truth to it, that is useful in many situations. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at there. But I think that like in a static culture that isn't changing, you're not getting that many distinct tests of an idea, as opposed to say like, hey, I emailed this to everybody in the universe and they all liked it, they all found it useful. That would impress me, because they're all such different situations. Anyway, that's not a central thing, but
a realist or anyone who rejects relativism should be unsurprised by this idea that people independently, communities, ancient tribes, discovered the same thing at certain points, came across the same good explanations. Mathematicians separated by thousands of miles discover the same thing at approximately the same time. Any biologist working in Africa is going to discover the same laws that govern evolution by natural selection as someone working in America. So in the same way, if we reject relativism and say, look, there is such a thing as moral truth and moral reality, things that allow for flourishing, then it would be unsurprising that these disparate groups discovered the same things over time. And so religions do have this, insofar as their useful, true good will contain very similar useful, true good claims to reality, namely how to enable people to flourish, how to have loving families, how to name your thing that you're going to get that's good out of religion. It should appear there. Of course, if you're a relativist, then you're going to struggle mightily to explain this phenomenon, and of course many people are.
Does the fact that, because your point is static, like those religions you could say are static, in that the example of the shark, it's in the same environment for how many hundreds of millions of years. I believe Weinstein's argument, you should ask him this too, is because those religions have existed for such a long period of time, they actually have gone through those tests. As a heuristic, they're the only thing that we know have stood the test of time, versus if we're like you and I, let's say we come with a new political system or something. Well, conceptually it might be good and we might see the fruits of it for the first 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. But that has not had enough time to had selection pressures acted on it. So do you think that, I guess, how do you think of that in terms of, is that's a strong case for religion, or do you think Bret Weinstein's missing something when he thinks about that?
Well, by the way, the idea that you have to like wait 1 million years to tell if an idea is good, it's going to take you a while to make a lot of progress.
No, not 1 million years.
As a general thing.
Although the ideas because ideas question about how long they've been around, but things that have been around for millions of years, we can say
Squirrels.
Provide an adaptive advantage for sure.
But there's a close connection here, by the way, with like a sort of philosophy of science thing, which is that if you talk about, hey, I have a theory, I want to test it. If you just test it against some particular thing and it works, like you do a little experiment, and you just keep like repeating that one experiment over time, like maybe in a Bayesian philosophy or something, I don't know, like you would consider that like, oh, I'm getting a lot more good data. But it's like, dude, you're just flipping a coin in the same place again and again. You're doing the same experiment again and again. Like, why do you think that's really giving you that much more information? Whereas if you say, hey, I tested this Einstein's theory here on Earth, and then I went out and did this very specific thing and to look at eclipse and get some data out there, that's a very different thing, and there's a very particular reason that you did it. You're getting something new by looking at this other very different thing, something you could never get by just looking repeatedly at this one area. So culturally as well, if you're just saying, hey, I did the same thing again and again in the same context again and again, this is not giving you new information in that much of a sense. I guess implicitly you could say, hey, they've been around 10,000 years, there was floods, there was fires, so I guess you're kind of baking in those things. But eventually you kind of done all that. People got sick, there was a war, there was some weird weather, and it could handle all that. Cool. But still, it's a fairly narrow set of things ultimately.
Right.
Up on what you said, that that certain ideas that survive have been subjected to critical tests. Therefore, that's something in argument in their favour.
Adaptiveness of it, yeah.
But remember that we talked about anti-rational memes, that there are these ideas that persist, not because they've been subject to criticism, but for exactly the opposite reason, that they've been held immune from criticism, because you're told, do not criticise this thing under pain of death or going to eternal hellfire and so on. So therefore you do have, now why does astrology survive? Well, you could talk about that, but why do certain evil ideas in Islam just continue to be copied over and over again? It's not because they're standing up against the tests and surviving. It's because they're doing quite the opposite thing. Everyone in that society is saying, don't you dare criticise this thing. Where it says, I don't know if it does, but where it says, do not allow little girls to read or become literate, that's not because everyone's been testing that idea and trying to criticise it, but exactly the opposite is happening. If you dare criticise it, now you're in trouble.
So when I say testing, I don't mean rational critique. And because there's kind of a separate. I do want to get into the transhumanist kind of. Can we download consciousness to a computer and all that? Because I think that's cool. Although I disagree with that. But it's sort of like.
I'll fight you on that one.
Yeah. Right. Yes. No discussion on that. I'm trying to pick an example that would not be controversial, but I don't think there's any example I can pick anymore that
You're
is
like,
not
I don't want any views.
So
I don't want any views on this.
No. Well, but like for example,
You're going to draw a picture of Muhammad?
actually, well, yeah, right, yeah. This is on my notebook here. Well, I think in Sam Harris's TED Talk, I think he's only done one. I think he starts with the example. He has Islam putting women in burqas, like head to toe. We can say, okay,
And then the scantily clad.
right.
Yeah.
Both of those are not ideal, most likely, well, I would think.
For space travel.
What's that?
For space travel.
Yeah, right,
travel,
for space travel, correct. But even ideal from like a social perspective. So like, for example, I guess I could narrow it to like just even monogamy. It's like a society that is there. I believe there are people who would disagree with this, but like monogamy is an important element in the stability of a society. And historically, societies tend to decay when monogamy breaks down. You have all this like polyamory, it reverts to like one dude and having harems and all that. It's like that's a sign of that precedes the reduction of human flourishing, let's say.
If you don't like harems, I think when you
Haram.
say
So haram is when it's bad. Yeah, haram is something that's like sinful.
harems are haram.
Yeah, harems are haram. That'll be the title of this podcast. Why harems are haram.
Bonnie Blue is ushering in Armageddon.
Yeah, well, it's in you'd say that tongue in cheek, but it's like it's like
All
the
that
dogma.
all that doing is leading to doom.
Yeah, but like the idea of if you like, for example, if you know. I'll stick with the monogamy. If you cheat on your wife, you'll go to hell. If you cheat on your partner, you go to hell. That's a good dogma, in my opinion, because if we can say rationally, monogamy is or if we just accept that monogamy is an essential part of a flourishing, stable society, then the dogma that prevents you from questioning it is able to stay in place.
I could buy all the dogma stuff if it was just more like, hey, I want to take this idea real seriously. Then we're good.
And give reasons for it. So rather than saying, if you cheat on your wife, you'll go to hell, why not just explain why cheating on your wife is a bad idea and you can ignore the hell stuff?
Because that's a good point. And I'm picking probably a bad example here, but is it possible that there are some problems that you cannot rationally articulate why they're bad? You only find out they're bad if you act them out, and then it's too late. And my argument for religion would be, human society, we have a human nature. We have our social chimp brains that are, tracking social status and all that stuff. That's the test that religions have repeatedly been subject to. And the norms that come out of religion are the rules of social interaction that we've learned, hey, if you break these, society falls apart. But maybe it's the case that the complexity of that is so much so that I can't actually make a rational case for why that is.
Also, those societies have almost zero capability to handle new problems. So it's one thing to have a new problem in a society that can't handle it.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why fundamentalism doesn't make sense, right? But
Deutsch quotes him. I'm not sure if it's William Godwin or who it is, but something to the effect of, cultures are often far more wise than the individuals within them.
Right.
And so it's the same
I view it kind of like
idea
an external computer, right? Like it's an external compute that has already run the test, even though we can't identify the rules. It's like,
our nomenclature is just slightly different. I talk in terms of inexplicit knowledge. So the culture contains a whole bunch of
so how
things
do
that
you
is
solve,
known,
so
but you can't write it down.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So the question you just raised, which is like, okay, what if we allow this thing to happen? I think it's bad, you'd say, to like depart from monogamy, let's say. So you say, I think that's going to unravel the culture. And I could say, for all I know, you're right. I don't know. But maybe the question is, if one person does it, does that unravel the thing? Or is it unstable
Correct,
so that
right,
one person will lead the
correct.
whole thing? But I think that's, again, this is a general argument about like, okay, we want to keep it the same or we want to allow some change. Part of allowing change, one of the big things is allowing small changes to happen, and then you kind of, that is the test. If you say, I'm afraid of all change, so there's going to be no change, well, suddenly there will be no change until everybody gets killed.
You're doomed.
So I think the answer to this thing is, okay, there's almost everything that anybody thinks that's new will suck. But because they're allowed to try it in a small way, then you can kind of figure it out. And yeah, maybe some people are going to die, or who knows? Like the astronaut, we don't know how to build a ship, and but some people died. There's some mistakes, but then we figured it out. That's all. Like the history of planes is like this. Is interesting.
Totally.
The whole black boxes and
Yes, and to that point, I would another, and I think this is a synthesis of Peterson and Weinstein, is another element of evolution doing its selection, or putting selection pressure on human societies, and then human societies adapting. There are certain individuals who are very high in like trait openness, right? Super creative, willing to take risks and all that. I actually do believe that there are individuals who can manage like polyamory or whatnot, like, super high and super creative, constantly need novelty. What I don't think them, again, this is all just hypothesis, but just to illustrate the logic of it, I think it's likely the case that the average person cannot handle that. And so we do have this room on the edges of society, the edges of the personality distribution, which I would say we're kind of in an edge of a personality distribution in terms of like, it's a very small percentage of people who, want to sit down and talk Deutsch and Peterson, philosophy, all this different stuff.
Everybody's
right?
at the edge in a sense if there's something they care about that not many people care about.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's a normie to someone else in some other domain. But yeah, so in that sense, like there's the idea, but then, and so those individuals, I think that's where the novelty is managed. This is just a kind of a general observation of how it might work, but I think that's where the evolution, or that the novelty can be managed. But the norms, the social norms, still need to remain. There does seem to be some dogmatic aspect. I think Jeffrey Miller is his name. He's a evolutionary biologist who's also polyamorous. I think with Diane Fleischman maybe is her name or something. And they are two evolutionary biologists who are both polyamorous. And unless I've remembered incorrectly, I believe that both of them say, no one else should be doing this. Like, it's like, this is a very difficult thing to manage. We know we're in an extreme minority or whatnot.
Dawkins had 4 or 5 wives. He's almost polyamorous.
There you go. Yeah, right.
Sequential.
Yeah, and I'm aware that I think this, I picked a bad example, because you can, people can dispute whether or not that's necessary. And in an environment that changes in the future, does monogamy still need to be there? Maybe not.
There's a technological, that's a cultural version of it. You say, here's a cultural idea. There's also the technological thing. This is where like Nick Bostrom says, hey, there's a bucket of new ideas. You pull some out, some are black. That means everything's going to get killed.
Yeah, right.
However, there's also ideas you pull out. He doesn't say this, but this is a counter argument. There are ideas that you pull out that make other things that would previously have killed you not kill you. Like there's a thing in there that is like a deadly virus. But if the day before you pulled out the thing that makes vaccines for everything, well, that's not going to kill you.
Yeah, right.
And so in there's powerful things that allow you to detect and correct errors. And so this conversation kind of tending to think is one. If there was no such thing as a podcast or conversation, then somebody who had polyamorous bad experiences could never explain them to anybody or how they overcame them. And so then everybody would be starting from scratch and potentially hitting huge walls. But if they can say, hey, it was really hard, you shouldn't do it in these circumstances, but if you are going to do it, here's how you do it, that knowledge can then propagate, and what would have previously been destabilizing isn't.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
There's good and there's
and
bad.
that's, like with religion, it's like, religion, depending on the religion, is criticized for being like sexually repressive and all that. It's like, well, if we lived in a society where there was no condoms, no birth control, and sexually transmitted diseases could wipe you out, like syphilis and AIDS, AIDS and all that, the correct attitude would be to be ultimate, like super sexual taboos and like don't have sex with anyone outside of, your one partner. But now we live in an environment where we have that technology. Does it make sense to be as dogmatic in that, like we can say rationally, it made sense to have that religious tradition in a time when we didn't have these technologies that solve those problems?
Even back then, they would have been much better off knowing why you shouldn't do certain things and be like, what? And then somebody's like, I know how to solve that problem. Just do this to make a condom or something.
True. So, yes, but I think the deepest problems of like, how should we live one's life? Should you have children? Like the antinatalist kind of perspective on things. It's like that's extremely rational. Like it's hyper rational, and in some sense, it's true, or it could. Like, does life contain more suffering than pleasure or whatever the calculus is? It's like, yeah, there's for certain people, yes, and you could even say qualitatively for everyone, but like there's something to, I'm dogmatically against the antinatalists on some, fundamentally irrational belief that like, I'm gonna keep sorry, you shouldn't swear. I'm gonna keep going no matter what.
But on the idea like the beginning of infinity, like if things are always going to get better, and you don't want to have a kid because things are bad now compared to where they're going to be, then no one ever would have a kid, no matter even if they had superhuman technology in a billion years, because it's going to get still better tomorrow. So that argument, you have to say, okay, is there some particular threshold of quality of life where beyond that threshold it makes sense to have kids, and otherwise not? Because if there is no such threshold, then the idea that I don't want to have kids today because tomorrow's going to be better, we need to fix these problems before we have them, that would apply literally at all times, forever.
Right.
So
right.
Problems are inevitable, of course, and so we're never going to run out of problems, and we want to be able to solve them, and we want to be able to solve them ever faster, so that the unexpected thing that happens we can deal with because we're wealthy enough, powerful enough, knowledgeable enough. And so when it comes to the level of society, although there is no such thing as a perfectly static society where absolutely no progress is possible because you've got individuals there that can actually think of something new, and there's no such thing as a perfectly dynamic society, whatever that would mean, a society without any anti-rational means. There's a black and white difference between these two things, the static and the dynamic, and you want to tend in the direction as far as possible towards dynamism, towards being able to solve problems ever faster. And so anything that exists in your ostensibly dynamic society that frustrates or slows down the capacity to solve problems, you'd want to try and identify that thing and eviscerate it. And if it is a literal dogma, but the way I hear you talk, it's not a literal dogma, because it seems like you would be open to changing or improving the things that are being labelled dogmas. But if you're not, if there are certain things in a religion that could not possibly under any circumstances ever be changed, then that would be a thing that tends that society in the direction of stasis. It's a thing that slows down progress. It's just a little roadblock that is arbitrarily there, not because it's not useful at any particular given point in time, but because you're saying no matter what happens, no matter what the problem situation is in the future, we'll never change it, even if it is a roadblock to solving our problems.
This gets into the transhuman stuff.
We can go to there, sure.
sweet.
There's a bunch of different angles we could go. This might be interesting. Why is progress the goal? Why is progress good? Why is that the thing we should be striving for?
Okay, we talked about this yesterday. Human beings, people, inherently are problem solvers. Now, if you don't want to solve your problem, okay, I'll still call you a human being, but you will die pretty quickly because we all have problems constantly of oxygen, food, whatever. And so that's what we are, we're problem solvers. So in order to solve problems, we have to create knowledge. And the creation of knowledge is progress. So all of these things are just the same way at coming at what we are as entities in this universe, things that make progress. You don't have to say progress, you could just say solving your problems. You could just say creating knowledge or something like that.
I think my version of that would be like saying that progress is good is a slightly verbose way of getting at things, because it's just like there's just this huge set of possible ways the world could be. And either you think they're all equally good or you don't. And so if you think that some of them are better, okay, second question, are you in that state? Are you in the best possible state? or is there one that is better? In any sense, I have nothing to say about the criteria that you use, if it's more godly, whatever. But if there is a better one, then okay. Then there's just a question of how do you get there? And so that's my research is like how the mind works, how you make progress. Just how do you get there? If you want to launch rockets and that's a good thing for you, how do you make that happen? But yeah, so it's just, you don't have to talk about necessarily like progress is good. It's just like there are states of the world. What do you think of them? And then how do you move between them?
Do you differ? Do you think that?
So I wrote down when you guys were talking earlier. I wrote something down. Yeah, I don't know if it's at odds with what humans are. You said humans are problem-solving creatures. I think of it as humans are game-playing creatures. Meaning, is it a this is what came to my mind when you guys were talking about static societies. A society that plays this like football, or what's your guys' favorite sport or game? That you guys
Science.
Yeah, there you go.
They're typical infinite games, you know.
Soccer or American. You guys all know soccer? Okay. I don't know soccer as well, but it's like humans. How do I say this? I haven't really articulated this before, but like, is a static society one in which the same game is being played over and over again? Because I don't know that that's static. If, you know, it's like you have the World Cup, right, every year. It's like, it's the same game that's being played over and over again. Are we solving problems by playing that game? Is that a static society? Because in my mind, it's like, is progress the goal? Well, maybe not. Maybe the goal is being able to play the most meaningful game. Getting as many people to play the most meaningful game that they can play, which might be the same game over and over again in different generations. And obviously the sports example is like a narrow, but like having kids, raising a family, moving on to the, and continuing the generations that way would be like the elaborate form of that game. But a society that centers around.
I would say that's an example of a realm where you could say that's the same game, having a family, raising them, going off to the next generation. But
yeah, but how do you play that game?
That itself can be improved over time. Right. So the raising of children, of course, is a crucially important problem that we have improved over time. Right. We're not just randomly beating kids usually.
Yes, right.
One way to describe that game again would be to say like, hey, what does raising kids mean? If you were to say like, there's some standardized test that all cavemen children had to pass, and then we're not still playing that game. We've changed what the criteria are for like raising good kids as well.
Right,
so.
And well, yes, and sometimes we made them worse with, there's many problems with the public education system now. We don't have to go into that.
Compared to cavemen, I think they're
well, I was going to say, I bet there's some caveman kids that would probably be better off now than having to go to public school. But exactly to your point of, if that's a game we're playing, there are better ways to play that game. But
also the rules of the game, in this case, the criteria can also change.
Right, but then that's, and maybe this is a bad line. You can stop me if this gets weird too, because I haven't thought this through fully. But like, the game, if progress is we're no longer going to play the game, or we're going to play a different game, it's like, I don't necessarily know, like this is the sort of, the hedonist kind of, or antinatalist perspective of like, well, it's pleasure versus pain. It's like life is about just maximizing pleasure and stuff like that. It's like, I don't know. I think this is, that progress, a static society versus a dynamic society. Like you said, there's not one it's not totally one or totally the other, right? And I think even as I'm saying this, the way that a game would fit in that is getting progressively better at the game. But even the other thought that came to mind is like when what was the chess one that beat
Blue?
Deep Blue was the first one, right?
First one, yeah.
Yeah. I think when Deep Blue came about, it was like, oh, it's going to ruin chess or whatever, because we're solving the problem of how do we get repeatedly better at chess. It's like, well, that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is because after that, I believe the popularity of chess exploded. It was kind of like made it popular. So like the problem wasn't winning the game of chess or even being good at the game of chess. The problem was, how do we play a game that maximizes human flourishing over the long run in terms of like, well, chess is kind of a narrow example, but like the meta skills of chess, you have to learn to accept defeat and learn to accept you made a mistake and not blame other people and stuff like that. It's like, I don't know. I think whereas Deutsch, if I understand it, is like progress is, it's a exponential curve, right? We're moving up.
If we decide to do that.
Yeah.
If we decide.
Yeah, there's no guarantees.
Nothing's inevitable. Whereas I sort of see it as it's a cyclical thing that we need to, and there's the synthesis of the cyclical going up, right? Like we have to go down before we can go up. Anyway, that's all breaking down the static versus dynamic thing. I have a different question, but unless you have a point that.
I got no point.
You guys think that you can download a human mind into a computer?
I think there's a certain argument which says, if ideas are computations, and if you can represent computations as information, we already know how to copy information from one computer to another. So if the ideas in our heads are the same kind of thing that we already routinely copy, then you can copy it.
That's the argument for it. Do you think it's true, or what do you, or how probable do you think it is that is the case?
Don't ask them to ask.
No probable, no probability.
Don't ask. He's gonna get mad.
That's our dogma. No percentages here.
But yeah, I think that's the argument. I think you could say that like some things that are happening in the mind aren't representable by ordinary information or computations, and so like the ordinary computers that you have as a laptop, or whatever, could never run the thing that's happening there. You have to argue something like that because you already copy information all the time. There's zero problem copying information, at least classical information. Deutsch talks about quantum information, which is a whole different thing I don't know about. But anyway, classically, you can copy information easily. So if the brain is made up of information, then you're good. So you have to argue it's not. And so some people do argue that.
I've, not dogmatically, that's why I'm willing to discuss it with you guys, but my intuition is that it's qualia is not the information that is encoded in computers.
I don't know anything about qualia. Like I'm interested in how like the mind is able to powerfully make certain things happen, launch rockets and all this. I assume that the qualia will come along for the ride, but it may not. If you can make a system that does those things. So there's a more philosophical discussion beyond my pay grade there. But like, as far as like, hey, you have all these ideas and a certain causal structure in your brain of how you think and how you act, I think that can be copied. And there might even be a better argument, a more hardcore argument that I don't know if you can say more about, which is sort of this church Turing Deutsch thesis.
Let's go there because physicists will come out now and again and say, oh look, despite the fact that Einstein said that matter can't travel beyond the speed of light, one day we'll be able to travel beyond the speed of light because we'll replace Einstein's theorem, we'll come up with something better. But at any moment in time, all you can do is to take seriously the best explanation we've got. And when it comes to physics, for example, the best explanation we've got about time, space and motion is relativity. And relativity says, you can't build a rocket that goes faster than the speed of light, okay? So I take that seriously, and anyone asks me, is it possible? I'll say no. Would it be possible in the future? I'll still say no, because I can only base my utterances on what I best understand the science to say now. In the same way, the Church-Turing-Deutsch thesis is a principle of physics very little different in status to something like conservation of energy. You can't create or destroy energy. You can just transform it from one form into another. The Church-Turing-Deutsch thesis basically says all laws of physics are computable. Every physical process that happens anywhere in the entire known physical reality is itself computable. So you can write a computer simulation to capture that thing. If it's the motion of electrons around a nucleus, then you can write a program to represent that thing, or an apple falling from a tree. Whatever it is, you can write a program for it in principle. Maybe not in practice because you don't know how yet, but in all physical possible processes is included what this thing is doing, what the brain is doing. So in principle, it could be simulated in a computer. And once you simulate it in a computer, you have in that computer something which is doing precisely the thing that is going on here, namely thinking, coming up with ideas, being creative. Now, it wouldn't be on the wetware here, it would be on the the physical substrate that is a silicon computer. And so because now you have this one-to-one correspondence between the two things, there's absolutely no reason to say that with some advanced future laser system where you are literally finding the positions and the motions of all the neurons and everything, the electrical signals that are going through, you could scan all that, stick it into a computer and have a simulated brain, which would be, I would say, I'd take the strong position of saying it would have consciousness, it would have qualia, because I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't think there's anything over and above what this thing is doing beyond the motion of particles and laws of physics and that kind of thing. I can't tell you what consciousness is. I can't give you an explanation of it. I know I have it, and so I would presume that it's nothing but the outworkings of laws of physics. So if I can simulate that to an arbitrarily high degree of accuracy, then to an arbitrarily high degree of accuracy, I will get a conscious mind in the computer as well.
And would you think, let's say it mirrored exactly your brain, right? Like we had a model of it, I think the determinist way of saying it is like, you know, every position and speed of every atom and electron in the brain or whatever, okay, and you were able to model that. It would have consciousness or experience. It wouldn't be you. It would still be distinct from your conscious. Like you would still be there, right?
Yes,
and
that's
if you
right.
died,
Yes.
your experience of reality.
Yes, yes. And in fact, it gets deeper and it's way off topic, but that's literally the truth in physical reality as well. Part of David Deutsch's entire oeuvre of work is explaining the multiverse. There really is sitting here right now multiple copies of me, all having the same thought.
Yes.
We don't have to
definitely
get into that.
Well, maybe you should definitely bring it up with Bret Weinstein. He has Bret. He has.
He doesn't like the multiverse.
Has interesting objections to that.
Yeah.
So definitely make sure to cover that. But
I think I did a reaction video about his.
I might add a little bit to that, which is I think like famously Derek Parfit has this book on reasons and persons where he kind of goes through the criteria of like, is it really me, basically, if you make a copy of this kind of thing. I think he kind of walks through a bunch of different thought experiments that involve like the Star Trek transporter and things like this, and kind of show that like, in some ways it becomes awkward to say that like, to talk about identity and to figure out like what versions are you, or is that the right even question to ask? Because there's a certain argument to say that like, I'm here in this chair and in 1 second hence a bunch of physics has happened and I'm still here in some sense. But a whole bunch of physical transformations happen along the way. So you can probably, if you wanted to get really detailed about it, start criticizing that and say that's not you either. And so ultimately, it starts to get hard to say that like, oh, this is definitely you.
This is you, yeah.
So that maybe is the wrong question. And so it could be that like, when it comes to this copying thing, you'd say, let's just set aside, is it real me? I want there to be one of me, and then one of me. At no point do I want there to be two of me, or whatever.
What is
So
Jordan Peterson was right to ask, what do you mean by you? Okay, so I get that. I get the argument. Okay, assuming that what's happening here is the firing of electrons and whatnot, how, I guess this is just my, how deep does it go in terms of like, okay, we have our brain, we have our conscious mind, but then we have our limbic system, then we have our brain stem, and then we have our body. Like how much of that needs to be simulated for the consciousness to development? Because to the point on like what is you or not, like what's part of me.
Well, it's like you can chop off your arm and you're still, it's pretty
right,
darn
but how much
good,
of, but like how much of me is located in my identity amongst other people? Right, like I'll cut off my arm if it means, maintaining, being able to be in society. So it's like, how much of me is in my children or something like that, right? That I hope to have at some point in the future, unless the antinatalists convince me. So it's like how much, I guess my intuition would be that like we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know what consciousness is to that point. So the idea that we could simulate it's like we don't know how deep, we don't know how much of, there's other, like you said, we can't perceive other dimensions and stuff. We don't know how much quantum stuff is going through our brain or whatnot.
I think to some degree, like at least with regards to like how much of the body you need to simulate at what level, you have to go down to like some kind of super strings if string theory is true. Like on some level it doesn't matter. Practically it matters, but like ultimately if it's possible to simulate it, then it's possible to simulate it. And then let the scientists work out exactly how to do it, and it's whatever. But probably the relevance of the arm and so on isn't that important, because we have examples of people And this is actually one kind of common path of studying the brain, is to see people who have weird brains, either by birth or by accident. Something happened to this lobe here, so they start acting really weird, so now we kind of know what that lobe does, maybe. There's a lot of that going on. And so there's lots of people that are missing an arm or something. You see, like, okay, their ideas must be up here because they're the same person, personality-wise.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in anything, so I was gonna say I'm not an expert in this, but not an expert in anything. But like, our brain is our entire nervous system distributed throughout our body. The thoughts that we have are motivated by biological, instincts and drives and whatnot. And so I guess that's my.
That's a tricky point, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is going back to the previous podcast too much, but like, there's a certain sense in which the human body kind of sets you up like a computer, just to be it can compute anything now. And so it supports that. But then what happens, what you do with that capability, it's like you have an arm now, you can throw a ball, you can use a gun, you can do whatever you want. So all the biology really does is get you up to that point to do a lot of different stuff, and then doesn't really constrain you after that in terms of what you do with this basic capability to think. So the idea that like I'm talking to you right now because some biological urge is wrong-headed to me, because it's like biology lets me talk. And then I say what the idea is in my head.
Yeah, but you don't. Okay, so I would take the exact opposite view of every single thing we do is deeply steeped in implicit motivation and implicit drive and whatnot. And so even though it it feels like we're just, okay, let me think of what to talk about next or whatever. It's like, you can't control where your thoughts are coming from or where your thoughts come from. You can sort of direct the subject matter consciously, right? And this gets in, like, we're getting into like the, describing consciousness.
But this is a kind of an issue of levels of abstraction, because like a computer is adding numbers, but is it really about the fact that it's made out of steel or something? I think eventually, like, you're like, a computer has to be made of something, but ultimately you can make a computer of anything, and then they can both add 2 and 2 equal 4. So like, was it really the atoms and the molecules that made a difference? Yeah. In that case, no. So it's at least possible, I think, that the human mind is like that.
We evolved some sense organs, and that sends information to our brains that we can then interpret. And we're not, victims of cosmic forces. We're users of cosmic forces, including the genes that produced our sense organs. So we're always getting flooded with this stuff, but we have a choice always to interpret the sense data that we have in our bodies. It's our minds ultimately that counts.
Because what you were saying before touches on this idea that you have these internal sensations. You were calling them drives, from whence ideas come, kind of thing. And that moment I sort of thought, oh, he doesn't believe in free will. But then you said, but you can direct sort of what you're thinking.
Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
No. I'm just wondering, like, are you saying that the person does have this sense of capacity to choose, or are we driven, compelled, determined by these?
Well, we
internal
certainly
forces?
are. To be clear, this is all speculate. I've never come down on one side or the other. The free will conversation always, to me, is a very pragmatic thing of like, whether I say free will exists or not changes nothing about reality or anyone else's conception of reality, as far as I can tell from when I've had these conversations. So like, yes, I do believe we're moral agents. I do believe we have agency and whatnot, but like the ability to care, this is, and I think John Vervaeke, you'd find very interesting. I just listened to, he gave a recent speech on AI, and it was like, I'm butchering it probably, but like one of the fundamental gaps between why he doesn't think that it could be conscious is because AI doesn't have the capacity to care, quote unquote. It's like caring about information rather than computing information. Caring necessitates some like goal or drive that causes you to care about in the first place, right? Like the computers are doing the computation because we built them and we're telling them what to do. But there's no such thing as a human that computes but doesn't care, right? Or what do you think?
I guess, so you said that in a recent debate with Richard Dawkins, he would just sometimes be like, here's what I think, and set aside the core point that they were discussing. I think I'm going to do that here. Where it's kind of like, I kind of like to imagine that the mind is this big circle, and in it are these little ideas. They're almost like a selfish gene kind of thing, selfish meme, selfish idea kind of thing. They're all bouncing around trying to affect each other and so on. And obviously, like if one of those balls in the head is something like, this particular book is good, then I may end up talking about that in the future. It'll affect my behavior and so on. But anyway, to me, my non-philosophical view of free will is something like the stuff that matters is the stuff that's bouncing around in the head. And it's not like what you told me or some kind of evolution that's far distant. It's like there's an idea about this book in this head, it's bouncing around, and occasionally it makes me talk about the book. And there's this other idea about how to drive the car, and that's affecting this over here. But it's fundamentally what's inside the dome of the mind that is kind of all these little causal agents affecting things. And if it was the case that stuff outside the mind was what was driving its behavior, like, hey, I just typed Tesla, go to home. Well, then it wouldn't, it's obedient in a way that the human mind is not. But
Right.
I don't know if that clarifies that much, but that's me spelling out a little bit.
It could be the case that computers will never be able to care. But I would say that could be the case is in the same league as it could be the case we can travel faster than the speed of light at some point in the future. Because again, as I say, computational universality just cannot be escaped from. And so
you think that the ability to care is part of our neurology that could be
has to be
simulated.
a physical process of some sort, or come down to the firing of neurons in some way, shape, or form, even if I can't say what it is.
I should revise my earlier statement of it's not that I don't believe that we can download a mind into a computer, because I know very little about it. I don't ever want to try, because I do not want to be in hell. I don't think hell is real in the way that Christians describe it. But you put it in a computer and slow down time, now we're in trouble,
I agree
right?
with you. Yeah. Before we solve, well, AGI will be solved philosophically, written down on a paper, someone will come up with a solution first, and at that point then the moral questions will arise. Should we go trying to code it into a laptop? What would that be like? I think that's a serious moral problem that we want to solve, because it would be hell. It would be, who knows what it would be like to be a mind inside of running on a hard drive.
Yeah, sometimes people will talk about AGI safety as in like we don't want it to kill us all, but obviously there's also AGI safety in the sense you don't want it to have a bad time. But
which is so wild that we.
But I think those are all
considering
soluble problems. Like you don't want to. It's the same situation as like you want to make sure that the embryo doesn't have some kind of genetic defect that makes it have no legs or something. Like, you just want to make sure you're not putting a kid into that situation.
You think we should allow, or we should pursue humans being able to live forever?
Yes, and I would also phrase that in the sense of like, hey, you think it's, do we want people's deaths to be not their choice? It's like, do you want to give basically the bullets and of the gun and the decision to pull the trigger to just like biology?
See, this is an example of just clashing intuitions, because my intuition is, like I said, the only fate worse than death is immortality. But to your point, being able to choose one. But even that is like.
But you're not choosing immortality. You're just like, I think, what is it? You're just choosing to keep going for a while. Is all. That's all. The only choice you ever have to make is, do I want to keep on living for the next couple of minutes? And if at some point the answer is no, the answer is no. But like, I think there was a study or some kind of situation where people were doing like self-administered suicide or something, or like, I guess.
Euthanasia or.
Yeah, and so I think there was a thing where you normally have to go to a lab or get a bunch of approvals or something, or it was just something, a complicated process. And they said, what if we let people just have like a pill they can take at home? Like, it's not like a big medical thing. Just whenever you want to do it, you've gotten the okays to do it, so you can do it. And apparently people would be like, do I want to die today? Well, Martha's thing is tomorrow. I think I'll stick around for that. I won't take the pill that will kill me forever. And then it's like, so-and-so's birthday is next month, okay. And so apparently they like, with the confidence they could end it whenever they wanted, because they had reasons, health problems and whatever. With the confidence they could end it when they wanted to, they were able to make choices like, okay, I don't feel nervous about it now. I don't feel nervous about the cancer making me have a bad time, because I can make the choice right now. I want to keep on going right now.
Yeah, euthanasia in the context of like if you have a disease, that I understand.
I think the concept of literal immortality is incoherent in the sense that it presumes no problems will be encountered that would otherwise kill you in the future. So your first problem is, can we make people live to, pick a number, 500, and then within that 500 years, are we going to find another discovery that allows them to live to 1,000 and 10,000, 100,000, asymptotically off to wherever you like? So I don't know. Would you live to 1,000 if you had the option? Would you press the button? And
Yeah,
say,
it's a good question. It's a good point.
But he never needs to make that choice. You just have to be like, do you want to die today? Do you want to die today?
Yeah, but maybe
Well, the option to.
Well, but you can make
Yeah,
a
yeah.
case that like maybe that, maybe putting that choice on someone is a worse fate than letting nature have its, what it's done for the entire course of human history, which is, life takes you at whatever time it is. And there's
Well, we've
obviously-
already changed that, haven't we? We've already
True, right?
radically
Yes, this is
extended
right.
the-
Yes, this is a very intuitive thing I'm coming from, because it's like, well, there's two angles. There's just the philosophical argument about like, what, is it worth it? There's the more practical, I would say, social thing of like, do some people get this and others don't? Because then you have like a Gattaca scenario, right?
But that's always the case as well. Like a Tesla. I'd love to have a Tesla, but I don't have one. What am I going to do? Start
True,
burning
but I would say
with
this
any
is a
new
qualitative jump versus a kind of a.
But ultimately, that's just a recipe for zero progress ever. It's like caveman says, hey, you have extra apple, I have no extra apple, no more progress, kill you. And then we never have flying cars. And we have better lives than kings did before, because
The
we had.
universe is a big place. There's lots of space and resources.
True, and I'm all for like space exploration, and space exploration should be the journey outward, and then we need to we're not going to talk about this, but the reintroduction of psychedelics in a healthy manner, and theogens is the better way to less.
If we
stigmatized
had
way to
digital
explain it.
AGI minds, you could do that without the side effects probably. And also,
Yeah.
not only like whatever are the best features of existing mind-altering drugs could presumably be infinitely, I said 10x, but that's pessimistic. You could go infinitely and figure out, as like I think Greg Egan does in some of his stories, they just have like a thing you can press and you download it, and you have the experience someone has designed.
My whole intuition, to whatever degree this is helpful to hear from someone who's on the more anti-transhumanist side of things, in making your case, which I shouldn't be helping you do, but whatever. My intuition is just like, in theory, like you said, you could develop a psychedelic that has all the positives but none of the bad trips, or the possibility of a bad trip. It's like, in theory. My intuition is, because we're limited creatures, the probability that anytime we try and make a significant change, the probability that we screw up is way higher than making actual progress. Now, you could say, well, that's an argument to never make progress, right?
But there's a separate point, which is just that that's true, but only in a very myopic sense, because you'd say what are the chances I can beat Einstein today? It's very, very low. So that sort of corresponds to what you were saying. If I try a bunch of stuff, very little chance it's going to work. But if you said, hey, Carlos, Einstein's theory has a real problem. What if I just give you 1 trillion years to go figure it out? You have access to everything. Okay, that's a different situation, because I'll come up with the bad idea, figure out that it's bad, and then move beyond that. So if you zoom out a little bit, it doesn't look like new things are unlikely to work. They are very likely to work, because we do converge again on good ideas.
Yeah, and maybe I'll put it in the context of, we talk about problem solvers. It's like, how do we know that we're not solving problems that don't actually need to be solved?
We don't.
Right, and that I guess that's my intuition about death, is like, my problem, it's a point of privilege, so to speak, where it's like, I don't, at least right now in my life, I've never had a fear of death per se. I'm afraid of dying, I want to not die, but the thought of death is not a existentially terrifying thing or whatnot, which I understand is a very different thing for other people. So it's it's an intuitive thing that I'm pulling from that isn't necessarily going to apply or appeal to them. But not living forever is, or not living for, not the being able to choose when I die rather than simply, but even as I say this, I can already hear, it's like, well, but then don't get a cancer treatment, right? If I get cancer, I should just let it happen. And it's like,
you could kill yourself better if you had
right.
technology.
No, and yes, and I'm struggling through it, as I think through it, but it's just.
By the way, I think about death is just that you need life just to do anything. There's an interesting definition from sort of the Deutsch verse, which is that knowledge is information which, once it's been created, keeps itself going, keeps itself instantiated, existing. That's one kind of definition. And I was kind of pondering that. I was like, well, that's not really about anything necessarily, if it's keeping itself going. But there's a certain truth to this, which is that if you invent an idea and it can't even keep itself there, then it can't affect anything ever. So like it's got to come up and it's got to keep itself going if it wants to affect the future in any way. If you just said, hey, I had a cool idea and I just forgot it, so it can never do anything. So survival is just a precondition for all the other good things. So you could even say that, hey, life sucks, you shouldn't want to live forever. And my argument would be that my argument isn't that I want abstract life or something. It's just that if I've learned anything and I want that ideas to persist and do good stuff, well, if you shoot the if Einstein was going to be the next great discoverer of the next theory, well, he just got killed, and all the good stuff that he had in his head is gone. So all the stuff he could have done is what we're missing out on.
Yeah.
It's not just some abstract notion of life that we're losing.
I guess to what you, because you said we don't know if we're solving the problems we actually need to be solving. I guess,
life destroys knowledge, just to put a pin on that.
Sure. Yeah. Or just even.
Or death destroys knowledge. Yeah.
I guess, and the articulation of my intuition would be, because we don't know that we're solving the right problems, or if we have the question of which problems should we be solving, this in some sense relates to relevance realization, like the Vervaekian kind of concept of like, what should we be directing our attention to? My belief is that the way that we answer that problem is not by rationally thinking it, or is not as much by rationally thinking it through, but by looking at the beliefs and traditions and ideas that have stood the test of time to get us to this point, and leaning on those heuristics. And when it's a thing of like, well, we don't know the heuristic versus because to your point, like everything I'm saying is like, well, why get the cancer treatment if your heuristic is don't try and become a god and defeat death? You could just as easily say, well, don't get the cancer treatment then. And there are religions that do that. Then that's where the balance that's where the rational discussion comes and the rational thinking things through. But you can never leave those heuristics entirely. And like there has to be a respect for those heuristics that got us here. Is sort of my Luddite intuitionist, defense, so to speak.
So my research is kind of partly centered on exactly this thing, which is I think that there's like 3 pillars to progress and knowledge creation, all this. Like one is you got to come up with new ideas. Second is if you've got some new ideas, you got to be able to figure out which ones are good, which ones are bad. But then atop all of that is like, what should you work on at all? Like if you have a million ideas in your head, which ones should you try combining to make a good new idea? Which kinds of criteria and filters should you apply right now to test? Because if you're making a new theory, you can't necessarily just require that it works on the first try. Like that's a bad criteria for making progress. But anyway, those are the 3 pillars. New ideas, distinguishing the good from the bad, but then also knowing where to put your energy, which of your existing ideas you should work with. And I think there's a bunch of criteria you could have for that. It's very open-ended. Like all these 3 things can be done in many different ways, infinitely many ways. And so in practice, we have people that are scientists saying, theory A and B logically contradict. We can just do the math, they don't fit. Okay, so that's one criteria you could say in science. Another thing is just like, I'm confused by what you said, let's say. And so I don't even know how to express that in mathematical terminology, but something in my head is saying, you said some words, I tried to assemble a picture of what you told me, and it didn't work, so there was some kind of failure. And so I sense that. Or you say something very fascinating and interesting. And again, I don't know how to put that into mathematics or anything, but something about my prior knowledge says what you just said is more interesting than what you said an hour ago. So tell me more about that. All these things are ways of saying, I have these random computations in my head, not random, but very sophisticated computations in my head, some of which are more mathematical, some of which are more fuzzy. And these are the very powerful tools that direct me here, rather than all the other places which would be much less fruitful to invest in.
One thing about Popper's epistemology too is there's nothing in it that is inherently anti-religion either, because for one among many reasons, I can't remember the quote exactly, I'll probably mash it up, but he said, I wish to replace the question of what are the most valid or authoritative sources of our knowledge with the question instead of how do we come to detect and correct error? And so that means that if you do have good ideas coming from religion, the Popperian perspective would say it doesn't matter that they come from religion. The source doesn't matter. Whether the priest is saying it, the Holy Book is saying it, the scientist is saying it. That's falling back on this ancient epistemology of authoritarianism, saying the source tells you that that's the reason why it's good. So the mere fact that it survived, that's a claim about the source as having existed for a long time. The Popperian would just come along and say, okay, great, love your ideas there, but let's see if we can detect any errors in it. And if we can detect any errors, can we correct them and improve on those ideas? And in fact, that's a universal claim, which implies that all ideas always can be corrected, and hence is a rejection of dogma. So it would reject any claim in religion to dogma, but it wouldn't say the ideas are necessarily false simply by virtue of the fact they came from a weird place, like some ancient tribe wrote this stuff down.
Yeah, and that seems like ideas that would, if they were propagated into the culture, would make civilization more resilient and able to make progress better. Because, you know, with traditional religion, it's like we have these ideas that are dogmatic that we don't want people to touch or criticize. With fallibilist, you know, Popperians, we're like, we have tons of ideas we take seriously, but the method by which we take them seriously, it's the survival of criticism. So have at it. We welcome that because we're always saying there's errors there to be found, always and forever. Yeah. So, you know, there's always improvement and progress to be made, even with their most cherished ideas that we take seriously. So that's great.
Including the epistemology itself.
Yes.
People try and trip me up on that. It's like, oh, well, if you think that you can always find errors in something, that means that what you're saying must contain an error, therefore is not true. No, that's not quite the way it works. It's like you take an idea seriously, even though you admit, and this is gets deeply into Deutsch's take on Popperian epistemology, where he said, if only we'd all agreed that instead of calling them scientific theories, we called them scientific misconceptions, because they all contain error. And that's true not merely of science, but of everything. Everything contains error. So in the final analysis, in fact, is false, which is a really counterintuitive thing that you can take on board, take seriously the ideas that you have, while also acknowledging they must, in some sense, be false.
Yeah.
There's an interesting intuitive thing. I wonder if this is kind of a piece of the static versus dynamic culture, like how you see the world in each of these different cultures. And I think like in a static world, you sort of see the world as being like everything is the way it is, and that's kind of how it's supposed to be, and it will be like that in the future. And in the dynamic world, you sort of see everything as a work in progress. You're like, hey, that desk over there is just like the best anybody came up with today, but I fully expect that it might be that I have a new idea and I could look at it and be like, oh, this should be fixed and I could improve it. I think it's kind of interesting, actually. It's even having read David Deutsch and other people, I think, it's still hard to grok that idea of like, I guess like the Steve Jobs thing. Like everything you see around you was invented by someone no smarter than you. It's a hard idea to kind of grok and see like, all this is just the best anybody came up with. It's trash, ultimately. Which is different from saying like, hey, there's a city out there with all these big buildings. That just seems like I can't imagine a better version of that, or that the future will be different. As opposed to saying, that's just the best pile of trash anybody was able to assemble. You know, that's the relativity. It's like, this is Einstein's mistake of gravity. It's the better mistake than Newton's, but it's still, you know, it's just the best trash anybody came up with so far. It's hard to actually see that, I think, and feel that.
Yeah. So we really just scratched the surface with Popper and Deutsch as well. I think this philosophy can, you know, do really well with your project, Paul. And there's just so much optimism within it, and this tradition of criticism. Like the dissident right are right that, you know, we need a tradition, and I think this is the tradition I want to help keep alive.
This conversation was an excellent piece of trash.
Yes.
Yes.
Always able to be improved. Yes.
All right. So we'll just go through. Where can people find you, Bret?
Website is www.brethall.org, and just search for Tokcast, Tokcast, and you'll find me.
All right, Carlos.
I'm on Twitter/X, DELA3499. It's a mouthful. Also carlosd.substack.com, I believe.
So you, Paul.
And I'm writing a book, so that's one reason to follow me.
Yes.
On all these AGI things.
I'm Paul PF Jung on YouTube, Jung.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, guys. This is great.
Sweet.
Keep watching.